Hello everybody, my name's Grandmaster Daniel Gormally and I'm from England. I'm from Northumberland in England, and I want to show you a game today that I played against Boris Spassky for the Zoe Varney Horsey Chess YouTube channel. And I played against Boris in 2002. And by this point I think Boris would have been in his 60s. Of course, Boris is very famous as a former world chess champion who played against Bobby Fischer in the match of the century in 1972 in Reykjavik in Iceland. Uh, Possibly the most famous chess match in history. And it got a huge amount of attention at the time. It generated an explosion in the popularity of chess, which has only been seen again recently due to the pandemic and also the TV show The Queen's Gambit, Netflix show. So yeah, I was playing Boris, and this was in the French league. So I used to travel a lot more. You know, life used to be more enjoyable back in the day. I don't seem to travel as much as I would like to now, um, due to some issues. You know, obviously with COVID as well. Not many tournaments are going on. But yeah, I used to play for Nancy because Keith Farkle said to me, you know, I play for this team in the French league. Would you like to come along and join me in the French league? You should play. So I used to go across by train. Took quite a long time to get there, even though it's France. You assume, well, you know, it's just over the water. It kind of is, but it's still, you know, if you're not talking about Calais, then it's quite a long trek. So the first weekend I played for them, I did very well. I beat Kirill Georgiev with black, so very happy about that result. And then uh, another weekend. This was another weekend later on. I played Boris Spassky. Obviously, Boris, very experienced player. So anyway, let's have a look at the game. So I played Bishop B5. So these days, Bishop C4 is very popular amongst the very top players. And the reason for that is because after Bishop B5, Black can play Knight F6, which really makes White's job of winning the game quite difficult. Now, D3 is a way that you can keep the game quite interesting. There are other moves. Castles runs into knight e4, d4, knight d6. It's the Berlin defense. Huge amount of theory. So that is the modern treatment against the Ruy Lopez. Of course, the Ruy Lopez is one of the most famous chess openings in history. And people like Boris Spassky were experts from both sides in the Ruy Lopez. Same with Bobby Fischer. Well, Bobby Fischer didn't play the black side. But Boris played the black side, and I believe he played the white side because he was a very universal player. He would play d4, but he'd also play e4 as well. He was a very good attacking player. He was a classical player. Well, I'm talking about him in the past sense. Boris Spassky is still alive. He's one of the very few players from that era, if not the only one, certainly of a world champion level, who is still alive. Bobby Fischer died quite a few years ago, in his 60s, I believe, at the time. Um, you know, Petrosian died a long time ago. Botvinnik died a long time ago. Tao died many years ago, and he looked a lot older than he was when he died because of his hard lifestyle. Um, Even Victor Korchnoi died a few years ago. So Boris is the only one still going from that era. So, you know, kudos to Boris. He's a bit of a survivor. I think maybe that was due to his laid back approach to life, general humour. You know, chess is a very stressful game. I think that's why a lot of chess players die young. And, you know, very few of us get to our 90s or 100. I think there's Pac Man. That's just Ludek Pac Man. Or was there some guy, Yuri, someone from, who's still going? He's over 100. There's like a Russian GM from that era. But he never became world champion. Boris did become world champion. Boris became world champion by beating Petrosian in the 1960s. I think he lost the first match, and then in a rematch he managed to win. I think there was a match in 1963 3. I'm not sure about this, but I think, or maybe he lost to Canada's final to Petrosian, who beat Botvinnik, and then anyway, he won the world title in 1969. He defended it in 72 against Fischer and lost the title. But anyway, let's go back to this game. So after bishop e5, Spassky played the classical approach, which is to move a6, and that attacks the bishop. Sure, white can take the knight, but then black takes back, and if white grabs the pawn, in fact, funnily enough, this variation was a favourite of Bobby Fischer, and he used a castle. And Boris had quite a few games actually against Fischer where he would play this. But knight takes c5 is refuted by queen d4, effectively, because you tap the knight and the pawn, and if you come back, I take on e4, hitting the king. And this just leads to quite a good endgame for black. 2 bishops in an open position. I'd already assessed this as clearly better for black. So this is not a particularly scary variation for black to face. So I went bishop a4. And we ended up getting this variation. And I went h3. So you might say, why did you bother to go h3? Why don't you go d4 immediately? Well, d4 is met by ed. And then, very important move, bishop to g4. Pinning the knight on f3 and putting pressure on d4. So white already has an issue that if he goes knight c3, we take. And we can't take back the queen because d4 is hanging. And if we take out a pawn, well, we can play like this, but then our structure's a little bit rickety. Possibly black doesn't even have to take. You could leave the bishop there for a few moves. Maybe play some move like knight a5 or rook e8. Certainly a possible continuation for white. In fact, d4 is theory, but generally speaking, white prefers to prepare this idea with the move h3. And after h3, Spassky played the move knight a5. I think he was more well known for playing knight b8, the Breyer variation. I think this is one of Spassky's favourites, if memory serves me correctly. But he would have been concerned about preparation. He would have viewed this game as playing against a young guy. He probably didn't do a huge amount of preparation for this game, if any at all, would be my guess. But he would have looked at this game and said, well, I'm playing against somebody quite young, inexperienced. He's probably going to prepare very hard for me. So I want to avoid that preparation and play something that I don't play that often, which is knight a5. There's a number of variations that black can play here. Can play bishop e7, rook e8, even knight d7 might be a move, I'm not certain. But I think the 2 most popular variations are knight a5 and knight b8 in this position. After knight a5, well, again, you know, I think just to say, I think it's a good idea to move around a bit in the opening as well, because if you're only going to play knight b8, there's a danger you become too predictable. So sure, you could play the Roi Lopez every game, but do you want to stick to the same sub variation every game and make yourself too easy to prepare for? I don't think that's a good idea. So Spassky played knight a5, and then you see the idea of this whole variation is to play the move pawn to c5, and the idea is that when white plays d4, you're able to create immediate counterplay against the white center. I think it's very important to have these pawns on c5 and e5 if white is going for a d4 setup. So in this position, I play d4 anyway. Now black does have other moves he can play here. For example, he can also play the move knight d7 is a very popular choice. And you get some variation like this. Knight c6, putting pressure on d4. And after d5, we can play the knight out to e5. This has all been known for many years. basically been played by quite a few players at quite a high level, and it's supposed to be okay for black. You know, completely different game to what we got in the position to what we got in the game. I guess I would have had to force the issue a bit more. In the game, it became kind of a manoeuvring type of game. He played Queen C7, and I went Knight BD2. So in this position, he went Knight C6. So White's main move in this position. In the game, I went D5, which is fine. It's one of the main moves. But White's main move by far is a move Knight B3, which defends D4. So if Black was to take, I think you get a situation where White would have very comfortable position. The Knight is already aiming at F5. The Bishop can come out to F4, and the Rook will come to C1. It's a very easy position to play for White. You know, often in the opening, you're not necessarily looking for an advantage. You're just looking for a position that's easy to play. And I think that would fit into that category. I think this would fit into that category. But instead of this very compliant way of playing, Black generally plays the move A5 in this position. Just very important to advance the queen side. So already you're threatening A4. And then that would make this move Knight B3 look rather silly. So after Bishop E3, Black goes A4 anyway. So now Knight D2. So at least now he's developed the bishop. And then you see the importance of this move H3 earlier, because now Black can't play Knight G4. Well, he can, but he lose a piece, because I play this move H3. Otherwise, Knight G4 would be very annoying for White. He'd have to lose further time with a bishop and possibly drop the, you know, or give up the bishop pair, which would also be a strategic gain for Black. Certainly, he'd have very strong control over the dark squares. So this is a fairly solid setup for White, and he eventually plays the Rook to C1. Lots of theory on this. We get variation like this, and you know, if White plays Bishop D3, Black can play Knight A5, I think. Or sorry, just probably play the Rook to B8, because you have to be slightly careful that if you go Knight, also Knight B4 might be an issue, but you have to be slightly careful that E5 might be hanging. But simply a move like Rook B8 is probably okay for Black. Yeah, so this has all been analysed to death. There's no real new theory now in chess. This is why people are thinking about chess 960 more and more, because so many of these classical variations have been analysed so thoroughly that it's very difficult to find anything new. But, you know, there's still, obviously, it's a game between two humans. People are going to make mistakes later on in the game. So, you know, I think you can get too hung up on theory. It's just about getting a position that you feel comfortable in. And I think you feel comfortable in. And I think in the game, I got that. I went so I went D5. And very important move by Black, because White is threatening A3, trapping the knight now. So you have to go A5. And Knight F1 was played. Bishop D7. Apparently, Bishop E3 was a better move order. We kind of got something similar to that in the game, because I went Knight G3. And this is probably, I would say, you know, this is probably the limit to my opening theory. I think I was just trying to get a position that wasn't too bad for White and was fairly solid. You know, I'm not like a Magnus or a Nepomniachtchi who knows a huge amount of theory and is just prepped up to the eyeballs. I know Magnus Carlsen likes to give out the impression that he is a super talent, which he is. Completely agree. But he's also, you know, he also likes to give the impression that he doesn't do much work on chess. The reality is, all these top guys, Boris Spassky would have been included in this. At some point, to reach that kind of level, they had to be obsessed. They had to be consumed by chess. You know, Boris was one of the more rounded world champions. He had other interests outside of chess. He wasn't he got on well with Bobby Fischer, but he wasn't quite the same as Bobby Fischer because Bobby Fischer was all just chess, so focused. Whereas Boris was kind of a cultured man. He read a lot of literature. Um, we were talking about Magnus Carlsen. Boris' style was very universal, and I do think that Carlsen is quite similar. That he can play a lot of positions very well. Carlsen often gets compared to Karpov, another great world champion. But I think Spassky is similar as well because I think Spassky was possibly the first modern universal player that he could play a lot of positions very well. Anyway, after knight g3, black played rook fc8. Yeah, and I played this weird move b3. I think I was concerned about black playing a4 and creating this clamp on b3. And so I played this move b3. I guess if a4 I was intending to go b4. And if knight b3, rook a2. Black can invade with queen c3, which looks like quite a threatening move, but white can just make a draw here. And maybe he hasn't got any more. It looks ridiculous to stick your queen on a1. But, chess isn't like a beauty contest. If the move works, it works. So bishop a2, the bishop would be very ugly on a2, and white would exchange on d1, and in fact win the rook on c2 at the end. So white might end up having to repeat, unless there's a better move. I guess you could go rook e2, but I don't know if that necessarily leads to any kind of advantage, and black could probably just retreat anyway. The whole position is very close. Once white plays d5, it's more of a manoeuvring game. And I think that was a risky choice by me because I wasn't very experienced in kind of manoeuvring chess. Whereas I think Boris was, obviously, played at World Championship level. He knew how to move the pieces around. I was better in opens. I'm better in open positions where there's a lot of tactics going on. We have to purely calculate. When you have to think about where the pieces should go, I was nowhere near the class of a Boris Spassky. So, this was possibly a risky choice playing this d5 move. But, okay, black didn't go a4. He went queen b7, which is also perfectly reasonable. And now he played this move bishop d8, which is quite a good move, actually. And this is one of black's main strategical ideas in the Shigarin, is to put the bishop on b6 and then try to exchange off this bishop on e3, which is such a good piece. Like this bishop on e3 just aims at, if you're trying to dull your opponent's advantage, sometimes it's a good idea to chop some pieces off. So bishop d8, and I think around about here after rook c1, I don't know if it was this exact move, but I remember Spassky offering me a draw. But he did so in a way that was kind of like, very loud, would you like draw? It wasn't like, would you like a draw? It was very loud. So, I remember I had situations where, when I was younger, I played like county. I remember I played a county match and offered this guy a draw. It was a rook b1 Groomfield. I was a pawn down. I wasn't sure about the position, and I offered him a draw. And later on, so I won the game. He carried on, and I asked him in the post-mortem. I said, "Why did you turn down a draw here?" Because I wasn't sure about it. And he said, "Oh, I didn't even hear you." So I'm like really meek. But Boris is very, very vocal, and probably anyone in the tournament hall could hear that he was offering me a draw. And I think this also, it's the mentality. It talks, it speaks to the mentality of these guys that they're very decisive in their thought process. They're not kind of meek, apologetic. They're very kind of self-confident people, world champions, and they walk around the tournament hall in a kind of self-confident way that they've got that certain bearing, that kind of charisma. So, but anyway, I felt like, well, I'm better, and my team probably wouldn't be too happy if I agree a draw in this position. So I decided to carry on, which, fair play. to me, because I'm normally quite a sort of like meek kind of person. I went knight h4. So now I'm threatening knight f5, which is probably quite a good move actually, because if the knight lands on f5, slightly awkward for black. He's going to have to take a time out to defend the pawn on d6. So he went g6, and I went queen d2. So I probably felt quite comfortable at this point. I thought the bishop is going to g5. And black has, a few problems. I mean, maybe he could think about taking on e4, but I think that's a little bit of a crazy sacrifice. Generally, that's probably not going to work. I do remember we sort of discussed some lines like that after the game, but whether it was in this specific position, I can't remember. But black played the move bishop d8, which is a good defensive move. And now we're knight f3. So I could go bishop g5 as maybe another option. But that might have been a little bit playing into black's hands to some degree. I don't know why this is considered to be an inferior move. The computer doesn't seem to like it. Maybe the move a4 would come to... Yeah, maybe a4 is an issue for white. And sometimes this can be a problem because a3 is quite weak, even though probably white will manage to take... he may be able to take the b3 pawn. Black starts to get very active. Stuff like this might even, maybe I can just go directly after the a3 pawn with something like queen a6, or take on c1 followed by queen a6. Also possible. But another move might be rook c4, getting the rook very active. I'm not sure. It's very unclear. Alternatively, black could think about a move knight e8. But that might, again, that might actually help white, because what you want is you want a kind of very straightforward position like this. Maybe f4 there wasn't so hot. But in general, that is something that black has to watch out for. It's possible I could prepare it first with rook f1, or I could play a move like queen h6, intending knight f3 to g5 or f4. Another move is b4, kicking the knight. That would be a good move actually, because then black knight isn't going to land on b3, and if he comes back something like this, I can simply reinforce that pawn, free up the queen, and then go for some kind of attack on the king side. So all these variations were possible, but I decided to play the move knight f3. So I wanted to retain this bishop on e3. Black played a4. And then, when he went a4, I think I was expecting him to play knight b3. I don't think taking on e4 is working here. I think this is just too much. Variations like this just don't impress for black. I can take on f4. So knight b3 makes some sense. Maybe that was a better move actually. I think that was what I was expecting, and I should take. And probably I will play a move like queen d2, intending to devour the b3 pawn, because I'll be concerned if I leave that pawn alone for too long. Black might play rook c4, hit e4. He might take on a3. So I would probably have gone queen b2. Now, I'm not really sure what black is supposed to play here, but I probably would have been concerned. I was quite a timid and anxious person in general, which remains to this day. So I would have been concerned that black had a good position. But looking at it now, I mean, white's position is quite simple to play, and he could end up in trouble. If I go knight d2, take on b3, go knight a5, black could end up in trouble. Bear in mind that Spassky is a very experienced player. So one of the things one of the advantages you have when you have that much experience is your sense of danger is very good. So you understand the kind of positions you want to avoid. You know, you probably remember, oh, I had that game against blah 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 in 1958. It's quite scary to think, yeah, Spassky was quite an active, strong player back in the 1950s, and he was playing against very strong players back then. So you know, that's and now I'm playing him like 50 years later, and he's still active and still strong. So you know, it kind of puts it all into perspective. But you know, at the same time, if your position's good, it's good. You know, it doesn't really matter who you're facing. So I don't know what the computer says here. But yeah, I would probably play a move like Rook C4 as black, or think about maybe going Queen A6. Actually, looks like a reasonable move. No, the computer doesn't like that. What about taking on C1? No, it doesn't like that either. Maybe Rook C4. This is the other move I would consider. Yeah, I think it likes Rook C4 a lot more. Hits E4. So why not? What is wrong with Knight D2? Must be something wrong with Knight D2. Ah. Can it play? It looks a bit crazy. Can black play Rook to C8? Yeah, that might be something weird like that, which looks very messy. I don't know if we analyse this after the game, but this is, yeah, very very messy position. You know, he's got these pawns which are very strong, but at the same time they're not really going anywhere for the time being. I think actually this is good for white, but yeah, I mean, if we look at the analysis, yeah, it does say white is better, but from a practical point of view, it's not very clear at all. So this is one possible continuation, which didn't appear in the game, because he played this move knight a6. I think he felt reasonably confident about playing me. But black's position is not very good now. Knight a6 is given as a mistake by the computer. So he should have gone for the more forcing line. So even people like Boris Spassky, they weren't machines. You know, they're not machines, sorry. And he shouldn't have played knight a6. That was a mistake. So now I played bishop d3. That was a decent move. He decided he didn't want to go rook c8. Maybe I exchange. He went knight c7. And I must have offered a draw here. I think I went knight h2 and offered a draw. And it's funny because Peter Svidler came over and he said, you know, you play this and this and you play f4. You play f4 at some point and you're clearly better. And he was right. And I don't really understand now. And I think I regretted it at the time why I offered a draw. So I turned down a draw a few moves before. And then when I was clearly better, I offered a draw back. And maybe around about here, he was thinking about the sacrifice. But again, you know, I think these kind of sacks are very, very risky and possibly just losing. Maybe you could take with a knight on e4. But yeah, knight takes e4 and then targeting d6 looks like but I don't think any of these ever work. So knight h2 was a good move. So I should have carried on at this point. So this is where the game is supposed to have ended. He went knight c7. I can't actually remember, but I think I went knight h2 and offered a draw. But it certainly ended around about this point. But yeah, I should have done this and then gone for f4. White is clearly better. Let's just see what the computer says. So, for example, you could get a variation like this, then f4. And now actually taking on d5 is more of a credible alternative, funnily enough. So we get a variation like maybe these are the lines we analysed. And yeah. But, you know, objectively speaking, it's an extra piece. Yes, he does have a little bit of play. But, you know, a piece is a piece. I could, for example, I could take on e5. Queen c3. Yeah. Actually, it's not so clear. The valuation's dropping. So maybe I was right to offer a draw. But no, it feels like this is quite good for white. Another move I could play, I could prepare that with rook f1 and play f4. You know, and this makes a lot of sense for white. Again, you know, if the captures on d5 don't really work, if the sacrifices on d5 don't really work, I think Spassky was trying to make them work in the post-mortem. So we agreed to draw, and you know, he started showing some variations. So Fiddler came over very self-confident, said play this, and then you know play f4. You're clearly better, um, and you was kind of intimidating. You know, I'm in the presence of two great players, and then I started analysing some variations briefly with Spassky. I was really impressed with what he was seeing. You know, in the very brief time we analysed, it showed to me that he was on a different level. Um, so it's a kind of like he's played this very boring game where he's kind of shuffled his pieces around, and then in the post mortem he's doing all these crazy sacks on d5 and all this kind of stuff. But it's just impressive what he was seeing. I can't actually remember. Unfortunately, I can't remember a lot of the variations he saw, but it did, you know, struck me at the time that this is a player of a different level to my own, you know, and it's kind of a world championship level. I got the same impression when I played against and analysed with David Bronstein that it was like a different level of ability, you know, that you get at the top level. That they really know that they really have such a great feel for where the pieces should go, and you know they calculate so well. You know, so it was a great game playing against Boris Spassky. So you know, just briefly talk about his match against Fischer in 1972. I mean, Fischer was a fascinating figure, but you know, I think one of the reasons why Boris Spassky was able to live and still around now and outlived a lot of his contemporaries, you know, that we had a more laid back approach to chess, which I was saying earlier. And Bobby Fischer was very, very dedicated. He really pushed himself. You know, I do think that chess is quite a stressful game in many ways, you know, and Boris in his later years did take a lot of quick draws. You know, his later chess years, I should say, he did take a lot of quick draws and understandable, save a bit of energy. Probably realised from an intellectual level that he'd already achieved the things that he wanted to achieve in chess. He'd already became world champion. So I think when Boris lost his title, I think he was about 35 years of age. So he would have been born in like something like the 1930s or the yeah, I think he was born in the 1930s. When was the something like 37? So after that, he never quite got to play a world championship match again. Karpov turned up. Karpov beat him in one of these candidate matches in 1974. Wasn't quite able to vault to the same level ever again. So maybe the motivation went down. I think that's what the implication was with Boris Spassky. Karpov said this in his book when he was preparing to play against Korchnoi. Spassky turned up at one of his training camps, but didn't really do any kind of. Oh no, hang on. I think sorry. Karpov talked about how he turned up to Spassky's training camp before the 1972 match. And Spassky really didn't do much work on chess. He just believed that fresh mind was enough. But yeah, I mean, it was sad that it was sad that Bobby Fischer didn't play any chess really after 1972 match because Bobby Fischer was really like a class apart. He was a fantastic player. Why did he stop playing? Nobody really knows. I think it's to do with pressure. It's quite a difficult subject to talk about because it's quite a complex subject. Why he quit chess, but you know, I suppose the big question is how would he have got on against people like Karpov and Kasparov? Because bear in mind when Karpov and Kasparov played in 1985, Bobby Fischer would only have been in his early 40s. He'd have been younger than I am now. You know, and I don't consider myself that old. He would have been a relatively young man in 1985. So you can imagine all the phenomenal matches he would have had with Karpov and Kasparov during that period. I do think he was a class apart from someone like Spassky, although Spassky himself was a phenomenal player. But I think, you know, Fischer was a player who got to 2770, 2780. Boris never got over 2700, but he still was a fantastic player. But yeah, the argument is, would he have been good enough to beat Karpov? I'm not sure, because I think Karpov really crushed Spassky in their candidates match. And so purely on a form line, it would have been quite close between him and Bobby Fischer. And again, later on, even if he'd have beaten Karpov, he would have then had to defend the title against Garry Kasparov. It's a real tragedy for chess that these matches never took place. Now, Boris himself remained competitive against people like Karpov and Kasparov, but he was never quite able to defeat them in a overall. I mean, he defeated them in individual games, but he never quite defeated them in matches. So, but yeah, that was my experience playing against a world champion. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please subscribe to Zoe's YouTube channel, and hopefully we'll have more videos for you, more content for you along these lines.